Good afternoon, welcome to Advertising Week Europe with me, Andy Johnson. Just finished a fascinating session on the Guardian stage about how the world's CEOs consume and share video. Joining me to talk about that, I have Roslyn, the MD of Alpha Grid, and also Enzo Diliberto from the Financial Times. Starting with you, Roslyn, how do they consume video then? What's the secret to getting these top movers and shakers really consuming video and taking it on board?
Well, it should be no surprise that they consume video in the same way everyone else. It's very much a whole-of-me experience. And so what people tend to do when they're thinking about a B2B audience, especially at the upper levels, is think it has to be very serious, it has to be very worthy. And what we're trying to say is actually, if all the evidence suggests no, it does have to be relevant. That's absolutely critical, but relevance alone isn't enough. It still has to engage them. It needs to be interesting to watch. It needs to be snackable. And so all of the things that you apply, don't disengage that part of your brain just because it's this audience. But what they don't do is share that video, because they know that their peers are incredibly busy and they don't want to impose on them. And so when you're producing content for this audience, you need to think about a really prolific distribution strategy, because you're going to have to hit them one-on-one.
So it's quite a political job from your perspective to actually convince these people the best way of doing this and actually to share it as well and get it out to a wider audience.
Yes, but evidence would suggest so far that that even with some convincing, they're always going to be shy sharers, as we call it. So I think really it's going to come down to knowing when they're open to consuming content and getting it to them on platforms they trust, which is a key thing that came across. Platforms like the FT, obviously we would think that, but it was really, it came through in this research, so that you're delivering that content in times of day when they're open to receiving it.
Enzo, tell me about this from the FT's perspective. Is it something that you're seeing your clients, your readers are really understand the power of video now?
Yeah, well, certainly video is a huge area of growth for the FT, seeing huge potential, and actually the research that kind of we presented in the session just then really just kind of picked on some key themes. We looked at the content platform and the devices they're most likely to consume video on. And to pick up on Roz's point about sharing, they are shy sharers. Over half, I think, rarely or never share video. But when they do, they prefer to do it via email, which actually, if you think about it, making a conscious decision, if your CEO sent you a video via email, it probably holds of greater importance. So yes, so generally, I mean, it's the research threw up some interesting findings that CEOs and senior business makers are consuming video throughout the day, depending on the device. But yeah, video is here and it's only growing.
Why are they such shy sharers? What is it about them? Because these are the figureheads of the companies. Are they worried about what their peer group's going to think? Are they happy just to share, be quite inward-looking and just share within their own group and community?
Absolutely. I think your point there about trying not to look bad amongst their peer group. I think if they're sharing a piece of a video or any piece of content really amongst their peer group, that actually only want content that's relevant to them, then actually sharing becomes very, very important, and being very selective is something we saw from the research. So they do share, but very selective, and it's a very conscious decision.
And actually, just picking up, one of the other findings was that relevance was the key determiner as to what they would view. So if that's the case for them, they are probably assuming it's the case for anyone they would be sharing that with, and so they want to be sure that this piece of content is absolutely relevant to the person before they will share that.
Yeah, and we also, sorry to interrupt you,
we
also explored, it's fresh in my head, we also explored when a senior business decision maker is approaching a piece of content which contains text and video and infographics, how they might approach that piece of content. And actually what's interesting while we're talking about video is that text is still really important. I think around 65% would go to the text first and then move on to the video and infographics. So.
And what about length of video as well? Because that's pretty crucial, isn't it? We don't want people being bored to tears, or our attention spans, I'm afraid, as human beings now seem to be getting shorter and shorter. So that's key, isn't it?
It's really key. 3 minutes seems to be the magic number, which isn't to say you should make every video 3 minutes. It just means you should never make it more than 3 minutes if you're making it purely to share over social platforms or online platforms. Unless, and we had questions about this in the panel, there are subjects that you just cannot do in 3 minutes, and I think you then need to be really careful about how you promote it and get people to realize it's worth that extra time. It's a different experience. Generally, the online viewing experience for video is a short-term experience. 3 minutes is the top end, 1 minute, fabulous. We had some who told us 30 seconds is the max that I'll watch for. So it's forcing us as content makers to be very succinct in how we tell stories.
And are they totally over the... and onto the fact that video is so key now, and it's shared by everybody, and it is a real key way of marketing your business over so many platforms now. I'm presuming as the top people in these businesses, they get that, even though they might be quite shy in sharing it.
Totally. There was no one, I mean, we've done this research for 2 years now, no one has told us that they don't watch video on different social platforms and on traditional platforms. So the interesting thing, which we couldn't really quantify in the survey, but having done a lot of these research questions myself, that we saw is that when we ask someone out of the blue, when was the last time you watched an online video, you see a twinkle appear in their eye, and you know that what they're thinking of is pleasure, that they'll remember the bit of sport or music that they watched or the joke that got shared with them, perhaps. And we weren't saying pleasurable videos or fun videos, but there still seems to be a connection in people's mind that viewing video equals pleasure. And so I think that's another pressure on publishers and content makers, that they don't want video that's not a pleasurable experience. As Enzo said, they would rather, if it's information, they'll go first to text. If you're going to get me to watch a video, make it engaging, make it worth that extra commitment.
So do the same rules apply if you're pitching your video at the top people as they would do if you're pitching to a general audience, would you say? It's got to be engaging. Storytelling is pretty crucial in videos as well. You want to get their attention and hold their attention. Presumably that applies to anybody you're making video for.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up again on the point Ros made earlier about, what the interesting, what the research said was that, relevance as well as the source of the content is extremely important. This is a key driver as to whether they consume that content, who the producer is. And that really helps them driving it. I mean, but what is interesting, as I mentioned earlier, was that actually, they are consuming video throughout the day, which is at quite great levels. And obviously, it depends where they are as to what type of content they're consuming. But yeah, no, I mean, it's very prevalent.
Yeah, I mean, if we had a client like a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi wanting to hit the masses, we would just take a very different approach. We would go for something that was very humorous, probably a celebrity who was known widely, or if it was a male audience, maybe something that's quite awesome and dramatic. Totally different approach for CEOs. The first thing we would need to know is exactly which CEOs, and would break that right down into what their job is and exactly which issues are affecting them, and who do they trust on that issue. So it's quite a different
Is it more
process.
difficult making a video for a CEO than it would be for a big client like, for example, you said a Coca-Cola? I mean, there's obviously different skills involved.
I think just different. I mean, for us, it's easier because this is what we do at Alpha Grid day in, day out.
Yeah.
But it is not something that a general producer who's been doing B2C would leap into and do well immediately. And I'm sure we would not leap into their role and do that well immediately either. I think it's quite a separate.
I mean, obviously. Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, Joyce. And by nature, they're obviously very time poor, and I think fighting for that attention has become ever more important in terms, particularly amongst a senior business decision-maker audience, who are consuming a multitude of different media sources on a daily basis, more than they ever have. So yeah, just trying to find that sweet spot is obviously a big job for Ros's team. But yeah, it's something which obviously the FT is working on very hardly.
Now, we always like to gaze into our crystal ball here at Adweek Europe. So if you can, from each of you, I mean, some trends you see happening in video in general, you think will really come to the fore maybe over the next 12 months, starting with you, Enzo?
Big question. Well, clearly, usage will increase. We're seeing that amongst, and I think also from looking at the FT, looking at it from the FT point of view, the amount of video content that we have now in our platforms is increasing by the day, really. So I think it's going to become, and just sorry to keep referring back to the research, a strong thing that came out is that business decision makers are consuming lots of different types of content. So a blended approach is key, rather than just focusing on the one video or the text. I think actually appreciating the fact that they consume content in many different ways is becoming ever important. So I don't know if that's a politician's answer, but that's kind of
it's a good answer. Don't worry.
Stargazing.
And mine's going to sound like I'm sort of pandering to our majority owner, the FT, but I think this flight to respectable brands and platforms might continue. Actually, I think there was great excitement around the massive different social platforms, and the senior decision makers are using them. They are savvy, but they are wary as well. And so I think we're going to see that the likes of the FT and publishers in that space have over the past few years become excellent at creating content and knowing how to get that video content, and knowing how to get that. So they're now leaders in this area. and we know that that's what senior decision makers trust. So one of the reasons we wanted to work with the FT, I think it's now heyday for those publishers. And I think if YouTube, I know notwithstanding the news flow of the last week, but if YouTube can sort out its current challenges, it's in a good position because unlike the others, it's very transparent. You can see who's uploaded the video, you can see who is producing it, and I think that level of transparency is now valued. And so for those who are taking that route, they will win, I think.
Well, Ros and Enzo, thank you very much for joining us today and telling us about your talk. Of course, you can catch up with this talk on AW Replay and also talk to us on #AW Europe.